Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as announced previously, we shall now begin the clustered interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples and the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. It is my pleasure to welcome to the podium Mrs. Victoria Tauli Corpus, Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, Mrs. Erika Yamada, Chair Rapporteur of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and Mrs. Anne Nogram, Member of the Board of Trustees of the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Populations. Before I give the floor to the mandate holders, I would like to remind you that the list of speakers will be closed in 15 minutes. And without any due delay, I'll pass the floor to Mrs. Victoria Tauli Corpus to present her reports. Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, indigenous peoples representatives, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to address the Human Rights Council today and present my reports. I would like to start by expressing my gratitude to the numerous states, indigenous peoples, and others, and in particular to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for the support they have provided as I have carried out my mandate over the past year. I have, in the exercise of my mandate, observed a worrying escalation in the attacks, criminalization, and threats against indigenous peoples who are defending their rights to protect their lands, territories, and resources. For this reason, I have decided to dedicate my thematic report to the Council to this topic. As I have documented through country visits and communications, attacks and criminalization arise in most cases when indigenous leaders and community members voice opposition to large-scale projects relating to extractive industries, agribusiness, infrastructure, hydroelectric dams, and logging. These violations are occurring in the context of intensified competition for and exploitation of natural resources. Large so-called development projects are causing irreparable harm to our environment and to the natural resources that indigenous peoples depend on for their survival. Conservation projects and climate change adaptation and mitigation measures also risk undermining the rights of indigenous peoples unless they build in human rights safeguards. Indigenous peoples' ways of life and subsistence have been deemed illegal or incompatible with conservation and climate change projects, leading to the prohibition of indigenous traditional livelihoods and the arrest, detention, and forced eviction of indigenous peoples. In the worst situations, escalating militarization, fueled by the demand over natural resources, results in indigenous peoples being targeted under national security acts and the anti-terrorism legislation, putting them in the line of fire, at times literally by the army, the police, and private armed actors. I am particularly concerned over the rapid increase of projects commonly funded through international and bilateral investment agreements, where the financial gains primarily benefit foreign investors who have little or no regard for the rights and well-being of indigenous communities or for environmental protection. Indigenous peoples are increasingly challenging projects on their traditional lands through social mobilization and legal avenues. In retaliation for advocating for the protection of their lands, territories, and resources, indigenous peoples are being accused of being obstacles to development and acting against national interests. This places indigenous communities who seek to protect their lands at the forefront of the conflict as targets of persecution. A common pattern is that large-scale projects are frequently undertaken without consulting the indigenous peoples concerned, nor is there free, prior, and informed consent sought. When measures have been undertaken to consult with indigenous peoples, these have often been culturally inappropriate, lack good faith, and been driven primarily by an incentive to have already elaborated projects rubber-stamped with no intention of allowing for genuine review or participation in their design and execution. A crucial underlying cause of the current intensified attacks is the failure to respect collective land rights and to provide indigenous communities with secure land tenure, as this in turn undermines their ability to effectively defend their lands from the damage caused by large-scale projects. Disregard of indigenous rights of traditional land ownership breeds tensions, violence, and criminalization as indigenous peoples become trespassers or illegal occupants of their own lands, subjected to criminal charges and forcibly evicted from the lands they rely upon for their livelihoods, social and cultural cohesion, and spiritual traditions. Mr. President, my report highlights examples of specific cases and countries. However, it only provides a snapshot of a widespread global pattern, as in large parts of the world, many attacks against indigenous defenders go unreported and never figure in the media. I have recorded disconcerting and rising numbers of attacks, acts of violence, threats, and criminalization of indigenous peoples globally, with particular incidents in Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, India, Kenya, Mexico, Peru, and the Philippines. The same countries have been identified by other human rights mechanisms and by the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders and civil society organizations that monitor attacks against indigenous peoples, providing consistent indications that these countries represent particularly worrying situations. Authorities have repeatedly been urged to take action but have failed to take adequate measures to improve the protection of indigenous peoples. Indigenous leaders and communities seeking to raise their concern over the negative impacts of projects on their rights, livelihoods, and the environment have been targeted and killed, forcibly evicted, threatened, and subjected to insidious harassment in the form of criminal charges, which are often nebulous, grossly inflated, or fictitious. The aim of these attacks, whether violent or legal, is to silence any opposition by indigenous peoples to business interests and to prevent indigenous peoples from exercising their rights. Although some global estimates exist of the number of defenders who have been killed, there is no such information available on the extent to which judicial harassment and criminal charges are levied against indigenous peoples. Commonly, criminal charges are brought against indigenous peoples who oppose large-scale projects and seek to inform and organize their communities, demanding access to information and right to participate in consultations and to give their free prior informed consent. Racist defamation and smear campaigns, often initiated by private interests, are commonly directed against indigenous leaders before criminal charges are issued. Prosecutors and judges contribute to the misuse of criminal law by accepting uncorroborated accusations and issuing warrants without sufficient evidence, allowing unfounded prosecutions to advance, and improperly interpreting the law to incriminate indigenous defenders. While legislators may not be directly involved in the Criminalization Act, they contribute through the adoption of legislation that includes vague definitions of criminal offenses, including serious offenses such as terrorism, or that unduly punishes the exercise of rights such as freedom of expression and assembly. Multiple, broad, and ill-defined criminal charges are often brought, including charges such as trespassing, usurpation, conspiracy, kidnapping, coercion, disturbance of public order, and incitement of crime. Indigenous peoples are particularly disadvantaged in criminal proceedings, as they often are not provided adequate legal counsel or interpretation in indigenous languages and may be held in prolonged pre-trial detention, sometimes years far away from their family and community. The attacks, killings, and criminalization of indigenous leaders damage the social fabric of indigenous communities. Prosecution and detention cause significant impacts on indigenous individuals' mental and physical well-being, jeopardize their ability to maintain their livelihoods, and reduce their possibilities to defend the rights of their community. It also seeks to censor and scare other community members to remain silent out of fear of being targeted themselves. Indigenous women suffer gendered impacts of criminalization. Smear campaigns tend to target indigenous leaders by spreading rumors that they are dishonorable women of poor reputation who violate indigenous traditions by engaging in public participation in advocacy on community concerns. The aim of such defamation is to disempower and alienate women from their families and communities. When men are detained, women bear the brunt of their absence as they have to single-handedly assume responsibility for securing resources for their family, including food and the means to send their children to school. During my recent visit to Guatemala, I met with numerous indigenous women whose husbands were detained and heard first-hand accounts of the dire consequences for the affected women in their families. In my report, I also address prevention and protection measures for indigenous peoples, highlighting examples of community-led initiatives such as indigenous networks and monitoring systems and the use of indigenous guards for self-protection. I also note the importance of national protection programs and policies and the role of international actors. I wish to emphasize that protection measures for indigenous peoples need to be culturally appropriate, consider gender aspects, and must be developed jointly with communities concerned. Among the key recommendations in my report, I wish to emphasize that it is crucial to establish accountability for those responsible for attacks against indigenous peoples. The widespread impunity for violent acts against indigenous peoples globally continues to perpetuate their vulnerability and marginalization. To prevent conflicts and attacks, it is imperative that the authorities at the highest level recognize publicly the rights of indigenous peoples, and in particular their collective land rights and their rights to determine priorities, participate, be consulted, and consent in relation to the development and use of their lands, territories, and resources. Combating criminalization requires a comprehensive review of national laws and revocation of legislation and criminal procedures that violate the principle of legality and contradict international obligations. Provisions that in practice criminalize the freedom of expression and assembly and at times indigenous livelihoods such as rotational agriculture, hunting, and gathering should be repealed. Private companies must exercise human rights due diligence in all their operations and adopt clear policy commitments to that effect and perform ongoing human rights impact assessments for all projects with the full participation of potentially affected indigenous communities. International donors and financial institutions need to adopt safeguards consistent with human rights obligations in all the projects they support, notably by requiring human rights impact assessments of all projects, the effective participation of affected indigenous communities, and they should also demand specific protections for indigenous peoples and effective procedures to pursue remedies if needed. I wish to conclude this topic by expressing my appreciation for all the expressions of support and solidarity I have received this past year, as I have been myself a victim of criminalization. Mr. President, I am also presenting a thematic report to the Council on Indigenous Peoples in Isolation and Initial Contact in South America, based on a meeting arranged in Peru last year. The conclusions highlight the need to redouble efforts to improve protection for the territories and environment of indigenous peoples in isolation and initial contact, in line with international standards. States should refrain from implementing actions that affect their lands and resources, while there's also a need to develop and adequately implement differentiated policies directed at indigenous peoples in initial contact, notably in the area of health. While referring to the thematic studies, I also wish to note that my report to the General Assembly this year focuses on indigenous peoples' own governing systems and the role they can play in achieving sustainable development. As the report shows, increasing indigenous people's ability to govern and deliver public services through their own institutions based on their own cultural values has positive outcomes in terms of better and more appropriate service delivery, conservation and protection of nature, sustainable and self-defined development, self-determination, as well as conflict reduction. It is necessary to document such examples further and provide guidance on how to open the space for indigenous self-governing institutions to govern and contribute to sustainable development. This is a topic I intend to explore further in the coming year. I now wish to refer to the reports I am presenting today on my most recent country visits to Mexico in November last year and to Guatemala in May of this year. I wish to thank the governments of Mexico and Guatemala for their invitation and for their cooperation during the missions and for allowing me to pursue my mission in an independent manner. Mexico and Guatemala have played an important role in supporting the advancement of rights of indigenous peoples at the international arena, including in the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and in the establishment of my mandate. However, at the national level, both countries still face serious challenges in implementing these commitments. In Mexico, I received information about positive steps taken in the fields of health and education, as well as efforts to facilitate indigenous people's access to justice. However, I could observe that the actual situation of indigenous peoples in the country reflects a huge gap between international commitments adopted by the state and the reality on the ground. There is a need for effective and coordinated action at the federal, state, and municipal levels to confront the serious situation of indigenous peoples in terms of lack of adequate implementation of their rights to self-determination, to their lands, territories, and resources, their political participation, and access to justice. Urgent measures should also be adopted to solve the violence and insecurity problems, as well as the poverty, marginalization, and discrimination that they confront. It is necessary to create a sustained and inclusive dialogue between the state and indigenous peoples and a new relationship based on equality, respect, and non-discrimination. In Guatemala, indigenous peoples constitute the majority of the population. In spite of this, they have never participated on equal footing on the political, social, cultural, and economic life of the country. I could observe that indigenous peoples face structural racism and discrimination in their daily lives, reflected in the lack of protection of their lands, territories, and resources, and in their difficulties in gaining access to justice, health, education, and political participation. I am concerned that in spite of the overall national economic growth, the levels of inequality are increasing. Around 40% of indigenous people still live in extreme poverty, and more than half of all indigenous children in Guatemala are malnourished. I observed that the implementation of the vast majority of the commitments in the 1996 Peace Accord on Indigenous Peoples' Rights and Identity remain unfulfilled, as do most of the recommendations issued in 2002 by my predecessor, Professor Stavenhagen, following his country visit. There has been inadequate progress, in particular in relation to securing land rights, access to health services, and bilingual intercultural education, and recognition of indigenous authorities and justice system. Both in Mexico and Guatemala, I received numerous complaints about the impacts of the current development model on the rights of indigenous peoples. The drastic increase of extractive and other projects fails to respect indigenous peoples' rights to determine their own priorities and strategies for development of their lands, territories, and resources. These are taken without adequate human rights impact assessment nor appropriate consultations. And as I mentioned before, I am extremely concerned about the increasing levels of violence, forced evictions, and criminalization of indigenous peoples in both Mexico and Guatemala. In Guatemala, I visited indigenous leaders in prison, and I am particularly disturbed by the killings of several indigenous leaders during and since my recent visit. My next official country visit will be to Ecuador in November this year. Next year, I am looking forward to visiting Malaysia, which has already accepted a visit during the first quarter of 2019. I hope to undertake more country visits to Africa and Asia. In addition to my country visits and as part of my mandate, I continue to share information to governments and other actors in relation to allegations of violations of indigenous peoples' rights across the world. I will now conclude my statement. I thank you all for your kind attention, and I look forward to our interactive dialogue. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you very much, Madam Tauli Corpus, for your presentation. And let me remind the delegations that the list of speakers is now closed. As I have announced previously, we'll now hear the statement of His Excellency Mr. Péter Szijjártó, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Hungary. And after that, we'll continue with this interactive dialogue. Mr. Minister, you have the floor.
Your Excellency, Mr. President, dear colleagues, I appreciate this opportunity. I asked for the floor today because recently, unfortunately, some UN officials started to spread lies against and about my country, Hungary. These UN officials receive their salary based on the paid-in money by the member states here, including Hungary. And these UN officials seem to use their positions to spread outrageous and unacceptable lies about my country. These officials usually say that they are independent from the member states. I don't doubt this might be the case, but they must not be independent from truth, and they must not be influenced by faceless and unknown international factors. And they always have to respect the member states. And they must not use their position to insult the citizens and the peoples of the member states here. Very recently, some UN officials have stated nonsense things about Hungary. Their documents issued by them turned out to be biased and unbalanced. And these documents were not more than collections of lies. These documents basically question the maturity of the Hungarian people, whether they are able to make their own decisions about the future of their own country. And these documents basically suggest that it would be better to put Hungary under a guardianship. And these documents suggest that they want to protect Hungarian people from themselves. And throughout history we had some attempts to protect Hungarian people from themselves, but these attempts turned out to be very bad. In these documents there is a fundamental lie, as if those things written in the documents would be the opinion of the Hungarian civil society, which is not true. These documents basically echo accusations of NGOs who turned out to be political factors, who took part in the recent elections, openly wanted to throw the government, and they became frustrated because of the outcome of elections, namely the decision of the Hungarian people. In Hungary there are more than 60,000 NGOs, and it's a scandal that in these documents there's always a reference to the same number of NGOs, which is less than a dozen. Always the same. And it is suggested that these NGOs represent the position and the opinion of the Hungarian society. You know, in Hungary there's an opportunity, there's a possibility that all taxpayers can offer 1% of his or her tax to support an NGO. You know how many persons offered 1% of his tax to the Hungarian Helsinki Commission, which is one of the favorites of the UN officials to refer to? 796. Not 796,000, 796 out of 4.5 million taxpayers. Transparency International Hungary received offers of 454 Hungarian citizens. Amnesty International Hungary, even less, 281. And they are referred to as if they would be the representatives of the Hungarian society. And it is a scandal that in these documents it is suggested that these NGOs represent society against the politicians. It is not true. NGOs are not running on elections. We are running on elections. We politicians, we members of the government, we members of the parliament, people vote on us. So we only have the right to represent the people. Recent elections in April in Hungary, governing party received 2.8 million votes. Third consecutive time winning a constitutional majority without a coalition in the parliament. 330,000 votes more than all other parties together in parliament. After 8 years in office. So my question is, why do not these UN officials, why do not their documents respect the real will and the decision of the Hungarian people about the future of their own country? And there's even one more serious question, Mr. President. And this question is, why do not these officials respect the human rights of the Hungarian people? Because the Hungarian people do have the right to have a safe and secure life in their own country. They have the right to make a decision whom they allow to come to our country. They have the right to make a decision with whom we would like to live together. And we have the right to preserve our own culture, our own identity and our heritage. And we do have the right not to allow those persons enter the territory of our country who would disrespect these factors. Mr. President, dear colleagues, it is obvious that the UN officials spreading these lies about Hungary are biased pro-migration officials. But I have to tell you that Hungary will never be a country of migrants. We will always protect the security of the Hungarian people. We will never allow one single illegal migrant to enter the territory of our country. And we will always protect our own border. And you know, UN officials would like to force on us impossible things, to allow illegal migrants to enter to our country. They say that migration is a fundamental human right, which is a lie. No one has a right to pick a country where one would like to live in, and in order to get there, violate series of borders. No one has a right, no international contract says that there would be a right to violate a border between two peaceful countries. That's why we urge the UN officials here to stop lying about Hungary, to stop applying double standards against Hungary, respect the will of the Hungarian people, and respect the rights of the Hungarian people to have a safe and secure life back at home. Your Excellency, Mr. President and dear colleagues, I can assure you that the Hungarian government will always act according to the authorization we have received on 3 consecutive times by the Hungarian people. We will protect the security of the Hungarian people. Hungary will remain a country of the Hungarians, which is happy and which is proud on its more than 1,000-year-long history and Christian culture and traditions. And once more, Excellency, Mr. President, dear colleagues, I would like to ask you not to allow UN officials to think that they are independent from truth. We must not allow UN officials to spread lies about any single member state here. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Mr. Minister, for your statement. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of this meeting. I would like to remind you again that the deadline for the submission of draft proposals is tomorrow, Thursday, 28th of June 2018 at 1 p.m. Any request for extension should be explained and communicated in advance of the deadline expiring to the Secretariat, and will be approved by the Human Rights Council only under exceptional circumstances. An extension will be granted only once, a maximum of 24 hours. The submission of a proposal after the submission deadline will be therefore need proper approval of the Council and the Secretariat. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll reconvene after a very short break in a few minutes to continue the interactive dialogue. The 21st meeting of the 39th session of the Human Rights Council is closed.